This is an interview for Break the Mold, a platform designed to reimagine resettlement, to create dynamic spaces that explore the varied and personal experiences of mobility and migration. With that in mind, hopefully we're going to be turning this into a series, speaking to students who are doing groundbreaking research into things like integration, diaspora communities, and identity across many different disciplines, and basically just having a chat about their discoveries in an informal setting. Many of these students themselves will have migrated across the world, adding a personal element to these conversations. If you hear this and have any comments and ideas, questions for any of the people we interview, or if you yourself are a student that has things to say, set me an email at bronwynmeta@gmail.com. Don't worry, I'll put it in the text below for spelling. Hope you enjoy the interview.
This week, we're talking to Atreyi, a law PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia in Canada. Having already achieved a master's in public international law and having a deep passion for human rights, the Rohingya crisis in Southeast Asia triggered Atreyi to look into the refugee protections in the region and how they're addressed in the current scholarship. So to begin with, could you just give us a bit of background into what questions you're looking to answer with your research?
Thank you for that really nice introduction, Bronwyn. I'm just actually finishing up my master's, so I will have it by the end of the year before I start my PhD. I just have to make the disclaimer that all of the thoughts and opinions expressed in this recording are my own and do not reflect the thoughts and opinions of either institution that I am affiliated with at the present moment. So I had actually been somewhat intimately connected to the Rohingya community since I was about 13 or 14. My second job was with an NGO back in Malaysia that worked with migrant workers and trafficked persons. And through that experience, I had done a lot of translation work and just generally helped out and interned at this NGO. And so I'd always been aware that the Rohingya community were a very particular kind of vulnerable in our context. And when I decided that I was going to do a PhD and in the process of doing my master's thesis, the Rohingya refugee crisis of 2017 hit. And it was the absolute worst that had happened in the region till date. And it was, first of all, shocking and appalling that it had happened at all, because this was definitely not the first, but it was the worst. But also just how states and how the international community and how scholarship was responding to it was really interesting to me. And so I just started sort of looking at it for my master's thesis more generally, just to kind of see how states were reacting to it and what this means in terms of international refugee law and what it means for protection, for the legal protection of refugees, because Southeast Asia is really one of the most singular regions in the world in that they have no legal commitments to any kind of refugee protection. So they don't, none of the states apart from Cambodia, Philippines, and Timor-Leste, I think, have signed or ratified any of the refugee conventions, or they just have categorically rejected the whole international refugee law regime from the start. And so looking at all of these things, I was unhappy, a little unhappy, but also just more sort of curious as to try and understand better why and how scholarship was reacting the way it was. It felt like it wasn't asking the right questions in terms of what's going to happen to these people, and they were just kind of ping-ponging, and they still are really ping-ponging back and forth between mainly Bangladesh and Burma, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of solution for what's happening to them and for what they're going through. And so that was one of the first things that kind of struck me, and just how we're looking at what it means to be a refugee and what it means to be protecting a refugee in terms of international refugee law. That was something that it essentially really bothered me. It bugged me, and I was like, okay, this is what I need to do for my PhD. Like, this is just what I need to commit 6 years to doing.
So you've you're focusing more on looking at how academia and how scholarship addresses these kind of issues, as opposed to kind of delving into the legal protections for refugees in of themselves. So academia often gets kind of a bad stick for not being related to the real world. Why do you think it's important that academic discourse is looking at the right questions?
That's a really good question, actually. To begin with, there's some truth to the claim that academia tends to, especially with lawyers, we've been accused of dabbling in hypotheticals in legal academics on more than one occasion. But it's important fundamentally because academia, all said and done, does not exist in a vacuum. It is born of the societies that we live in. It is born of the societies that we operate in. And you have to be asking the right questions in every strata of society for some sort of mobility to take place eventually at some point with enough traction. And traction has to come from everywhere. And to say that academia doesn't need to be busying itself with asking questions is not good enough, I feel. And more importantly, seeing as I study in very Western institutions, it's even more important that these conversations about problems that are going on completely the other side of the world are talked about and are brought up on the other side of the world. Because otherwise, it's just super easy to ignore the fact that there are a bunch of poor people fleeing for their lives in Burma.
So, as you've said, Southeast Asian countries, apart from the specific ones you mentioned, have rejected the international law regime when it comes to refugees. But academia hasn't yet sufficiently explained why that's the case. What are some of the misconceptions and the kind of problematic themes that seem to come up in academia that you hope that your research will tackle or debunk?
So, some of the more traditional claims, and once again, there's no smoke without fire. Some of the more traditional claims that scholars kind of deep dive into are the claims that states themselves have made. So Southeast Asian states have in the past insisted that because collectively they've decided politically on the principle of non-interference when it comes to their bilateral relationships, that refugee issues are something that, refugee crises are born of internal conflicts, mostly in Southeast Asia. And so states have been like, oh, and we don't mess with other states' internal issues, and therefore we reject this regime. And then another classic sort of consternation of the region has been, or at least one of their official policies has been, that the pre-existing regime, which consists mostly of the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, as well as the UNHCR, which is the UN body on the management of refugee crises. So most third world or developing states had, at the time of their inception, rejected these institutions as being vastly too Eurocentric. And there's a lot of truth to that, and I do agree with that. And today, fast forward to contemporary scholars, they're still talking about how this Eurocentrism has resulted in states not showing interest in adhering to these pre-existing institutions, which is fine. I agree, they are Eurocentric. However, that doesn't explain why there's no regional mobility or there's no regional effort or initiative to try and form any kind of protectionary network or mechanism for refugees that aren't Eurocentric or for that are better suited for non-European refugees. So that's another traditional argument that states have made, and that scholars then echo and say that, oh, here are some of the reasons why, but they're still not. And I think that, going back again a little bit to your question as to why it's important for academia to question these things, it's not enough for scholars and for critical thinkers to just say that, oh, politically these are the reasons and that's it. So for me, it's really important that you keep pressing and you keep digging and you keep asking. If scholarship wasn't important, then people wouldn't have burned books in the past. So those are some of the more common tropes that you find. in scholarship, even now. And as to what the second part of your question was, what am I hoping to debunk? So my kind of approach to academia and to research isn't so much because I really dislike offering solutions, because there's no one-stop shop for any of these issues. Are far too complex and far too nuanced, and there are too many variables at play at the same time for one random scholar with,
Mm-hmm.
at one random university to be like, hey, have you thought of this? They have. States have thought of these human rights mechanisms. They have been designed by the states. They are designed to include or exclude certain decision or certain protections or certain decision making systems. They know what they've done. They know what they're doing. So for me to show up and be like, oh, hey, by the way, remember this thing that you created? Like, that's not what I'm here to accomplish. So for me, my approach is, it's always been to just problematize, which I think we don't do enough. Academia has come to a point, at least from my very, very rudimentary understanding, it's come to a point where young scholars are really obsessed with offering recommendations or solutions to things that we really don't know anything about.
Right.
And so I think it's more important to just, step one is to ask where, what do you mean? Just really fundamentally just that intellectual curiosity that we had when we were children and we just didn't know anything, and you're just trying to understand the world, and everything's like, what is that? What does that mean? I think you just have to keep doing that in academia all the time, and that's kind of the approach that I take. And so I don't, so for me, with the aim at this point with my research isn't so much to debunk anything, but more it's to see where the conversation is headed, and if the conversation is heading to a point where we are collectively agreeing as academic scholars in law that it's okay to put our responsibilities aside towards refugees in Southeast Asia because states have said X, Y, and Z.
Right. So decolonizing our understanding of issues has obviously been something that's kind of become mainstream in the past few years, although kind of political activists have been talking about it for many years. So where do you think that kind of idea of decolonizing our academia, like, how do you think that fits into the issue of refugees? Do you think that there's kind of an important need for us to decolonize our understanding of refugees?
Okay, I absolutely love this question, because post-colonial understanding of the law isn't actually mainstream in legal academia. We are very much an alternative branch of public international law, which I find very entertaining, but also at some points a little bit concerning. Because you have the mainstream narrative of public international law as a field of study, and you have what people like I do, and we get sort of lumped under the label of third world approaches to international law, which is sort of a subsection of public international law. It's a school of thought, and it broadly falls under the critical legal studies subgenre of legal academia. And we are very much the alternative. Like, we are the harem pants wearing people in legal academia. So, but then that makes it all that more important, the fact that not dismantling your internal colonialist assumptions when you're doing a piece of research is not the mainstream at the moment is problematic, at least in my view. I think that at the very, very least, what law schools, and especially Western law schools around the world, need to do is they need to make a conscious effort to have courses and have more classes on alternative perspectives on international law, because it's not just like third world approaches is just like it's sort of a blanket subgenre where you get all sorts of alternative voices, but there could be, say, a different perspective, even from a decolonizing point of view, from the MENA region, because their colonization experience has been vastly different from that in South Asia, for example. And you don't have these courses and you don't have these discussions in class, in law school, unless you seek them out. And when you're in a predominantly white university, who's going to seek them out? And if it's just one student or one student of color or a handful of interested students, it's not like it's not really going to go anywhere in the class. It's just, you're just going to have like a mini seminar in the middle of a lecture, and then that's it. Your question was, why is it important? It's important because it's not normal yet. It's just not normal yet. The fact that you have to look for these classes, you have to look for these professors, you have to look for these particular kind of people. Like, you literally have to look through the personnel database and see what sort of research different professors do, which is fine, but the proportion of third world or alternative approaches to the mainstream is just, there's just not even a comparison. So that, for me, in and of itself, that is a pretty good reason to want to have more of these alternative conversations. And just really, it's not even just about dissent. It's just about, for me, it's about showing empathy in education, empathy in learning, like just knowing that there's no one right perspective, and there's always going to be a lot of different ones, and they all have to be included for it to be a robust and useful conversation.
You've talked about kind of the syllabuses and, the courses being offered. Would you be able to talk about your kind of more personal experiences as a woman of colour who's studied in the UK for your undergrad, in Finland for your master's, and now you're, theoretically, just depending on the coronavirus situation, moving to Canada for your PhD. So how have you found studying law as a woman of colour in places that you've kind of been transitioning through?
I'll start with the caveat that everyone's experiences are very, very different. Like, even amongst people of color, like, everyone has a different story. For me, the transitions haven't been the easiest. I've gotten different things from different institutions, all of which I'm really, really thankful for. I mean, and I wouldn't trade the experiences as a whole for anything. But the fact of the matter is that Western institutions still overwhelmingly do not account for how difficult it is to inject yourself into a system that is alien to you in every way, shape, or form. There's just this presumption that if, say, I'll just take the example of a generic university in the UK, because that's, that was my first university experience. Everyone in the school that I went to, or most people in the school that I went to, were British or at the very least European, and you had a handful of foreign students. But then there's this overwhelming assumption that because you're all in the same lecture hall, all of your journeys are the same. So all of your anxieties are the same. All of your after school activities are the same. All of your thought processes are the same. There's just assumption that you're all here, you got the grades, you paid the tuition fee, therefore you're all equal. And it's just not. And I think it really, really puts foreign students or international students as a disadvantage, because you're grappling with so much more than just beyond your reading list for the night. It's just not addressed as much as most of us would like, probably. And it's not specific to any one university. It's a culture. It's pervasive across all, if not most, Western institutions, because there's just this sense that this is the bar and you've reached it, and that's good enough, and that's good enough for us, like from our part, like we've done enough. And I'm like, no, you haven't. There's just so much more that you can do and you need to do and you should be doing. The playing field's not equal, let's just put it that way. So for me personally, that was overwhelmingly the experience all throughout. And again, like, I'm not pointing fingers at any one university in particular. This is a mindset. And actually, this again goes back to your previous question as to why different kinds of conversations are important in classrooms. Because if you, a white student, was sitting in a classroom full of other white students, and you had like your token 3 or 4 or maybe 5 students of color with you, unless these conversations were being had, you would also assume that they've had the same experiences, because you're all there, aren't you? You're all in law school, you're all doing a master's, you're all in Finland, aren't you? And even, I'm talking about, like, even this is inclusive of like other European students who come in. Like, it's not just, you don't have to be homegrown, it can just be from the general Europe area. There's just this belief that, like, oh, but why is it so much more difficult for you? We're doing the same thing. But if you don't talk to them, then you don't realize that your international counterparts are taking 5, 10, 15 more laps around the park than you are to get to the same finishing point at the same time as you are.
Do you feel that there are increasing spaces made for more voices, more diverse voices to come in? Or do you feel like the progress that people are fighting for hasn't really translated into the real world?
I think that with every kind of fight, as is the same in academia, it's two steps forward, one step back. And unfortunately, a lot of times the step forwards, if it comes from the institutions, it's usually paying lip service in, like in response to severe backlash. Typically what's happened is that you have a status quo that just keeps going, and then something happens, and then you have some form of resistance and revolution coming from within, and then institutions react. So there doesn't seem to be as much proactive efforts in making sure that there isn't a need for revolt in the first place. And so institutions behave reactively, and what happens is that then they try to stem the flow for the time being. And so you don't always, I mean, sometimes, yes, they make good policy changes that are lasting, and then you can actually see the effects. But for the most part, it's just for the time being, and then that carries forward for a little while, and then you have another resistance movement, and then something, it's just a cycle that keeps repeating. I'm not saying that people don't try. I'm not saying that it's not always steeped in malice, but I think we need to debunk the understanding that you can't be toxic just because you don't have malicious intent. Do you know what I mean? Like, you can't, like, institutions need to understand that they can contribute to the systemic differences and the systemic sort of unfairness, even without necessarily intending to. And reversing those inequalities takes proactive measures and not reactive ones.
So to draw what we were talking about before back into this conversation about diversity and representing more views, and not just performative diversity, but actually creating genuine spaces for more voices, how do you think that those kind of long-term changes will impact conversations about refugees and about international law more generally?
About refugees, I would say that there's a lot more nuance that has to happen and has to take place in the conversation before change can be effected to them. And I don't just mean like refugees from any one particular part of the world. I mean refugees all over. Like, the refugees are still fighting for their right to be seen as human, let alone as human beings who are contributing in society. So that's like a whole thing in and of itself that needs to happen, and hopefully will happen in due course. The biggest irony of international law, I think, is that, well, apart from the fact that it's not actually law, it's a misnomer, I think, to call it law, is that it's not particularly international. Like, just looking at my own area, international refugee law, as I said earlier, the fundamental reason that Southeast Asian states and South Asian states as well rejected it in the past was they were like, this does not apply to us. It was a bunch of Western countries coming together and deciding what was a refugee and what was not. And none of these things apply to us. And initially, when the regime started, when like the first institutions were set up by the League of Nations and the UN to try and deal with like little refugee clusters that were arising after the First and Second World Wars, they were specifically targeted for European refugees. Like, even though there were refugees in the other parts of the world by then as well, not so much in Africa because they were still colonized at that point, but certainly after Second World War, there was a lot of independence movements happening around Southeast Asia, and so there were a lot of the famous Indian and Pakistani partition. But you had these behemoth institutions that just were like, no, this is not, European refugees are out of our mandate. And so obviously then the reaction from Southeast Asian states was that, fine, we're not in your mandate then. And so don't expect anything from us. But then the devastating thing is that attitude has continued to prevail, even when it's their own people, so to speak, that are refugees right now. So these conversations are important because the main narrative is already not very international. It's already regionalized and it's already fragmented and it's already just people doing their own thing and then not really doing it all very effectively and everyone having their own agenda and just, so it's not actually working. And then what happens with hegemonic states and Western hegemonic powers is that they're like, oh, well, this region is doing their own thing, so let me not interfere. So that was actually why it was very important for me to apply to do my PhD in a Western institution, because I'm like, I want to have this conversation where it's not being had. Like, otherwise it's so easy to fall into the trap of just like, I'm sure I would have had a much easier time, socially and like, economically and all of that. In a Asian institution, I'll bet, like I would have been close to home. I would have been closer to good food.
Yeah.
It would have been great. But I'm like, no, then, it's so easy to fall into the whole trapping of, oh, it's just the third world complaining about third world issues again. And I didn't want that. I wanted to be in a Western hegemonic state and be like, hey, this is happening, by the way. So yeah, so I think these conversations are incredibly important, and change, like, it kind of depends on what you expect, first of all, international law to achieve, but also what you expect academia to achieve. I think a lot of us, especially like some of the more radical scholars, when we're younger, we come in with a lot of optimism and a lot of inflated expectations of what you can realistically accomplish insofar as changing the world goes. I think that sometimes just you spending a significant amount of your time trying to understand the just the sheer complexity of the world that we live in, just trying to understand one slice of it in a Western institution with Western public funding is pretty radical. Do you know what I mean? But if you're going into doing a PhD thinking my doctoral thesis is going to be published and then it's going to be read by all of the leaders of the world and then they're all going to be like, she's right, what have I done? What have I been doing all this while? No, that's not going to happen. Like we talked about earlier, maybe your supervisor will read it, possibly.
Well, even if the whole world don't read it, some people are going to listen to this and hopefully learn a bit more about the issues. And
Hopefully.
in the meantime, good luck with your research, because it's, like you said, it's important that these conversations are being had, and it's important that they're being had by, people of all different backgrounds. So I just want to thank you for joining us and helping us kind of understand these broader issues and have these kind of conversations that, aren't really being had.
Thank you for having me, Bronwyn. This is a really, really cool project that you have going on, and I hope that loads and loads and loads of people hear you.